Most helicopters were built to be seen, parading at air shows, filling news footage, mounted on recruitment posters. These 10 weren't. Some flew a handful of times before disappearing into a hangar. Some were built once and never repeated. If you're into aviation, hit subscribe now, because this channel digs up exactly this kind of forgotten hardware every week. Number 1. Sikorsky S-97 Raider. The S-97 Raider looks like it escaped from a science fiction set, and in a way, it did. Sikorsky built it as a private venture. No Pentagon contract forcing its existence, just a bet that the future of helicopters needed to break the old rules that had governed rotorcraft design since the 1940s. It uses coaxial rotors, 2 blades stacked on top of each other spinning in opposite directions, paired with a pusher propeller bolted to the tail. That combination lets it hit speeds over 240 miles per hour, nearly double what a conventional military helicopter like a Black Hawk can manage in level flight. The engineering logic behind it traces back to Sikorsky's earlier X-2 demonstrator, which first proved that rigid counter-rotating rotors could handle the stress of high-speed forward flight without the blade stall problems that limit ordinary single-rotor helicopters. The Raider took that proof of concept and shaped it into something closer to an actual operational aircraft, with a real cabin, real weapon stations, and real mission electronics rather than a bare-bones test rig. Only 2 prototypes were ever built. The first crashed during testing in 2017 near West Palm Beach, Florida, after a mechanical failure sent it down during a routine flight, and Sikorsky quietly absorbed the loss and kept flying the second airframe rather than shutting the whole effort down. That's the kind of setback that ends most experimental programs entirely. The Raider survived because Sikorsky needed it to prove out technology for something bigger, a bid for the U.S. Army's next-generation Scout helicopter program, a contract worth billions if won. It didn't win that contract outright, but it validated the compound coaxial design well enough that its bigger sibling, the Defiant, carried the concept forward into the Army's future long-range assault aircraft competition. As a result, the S-97 itself never entered production. There are no S-97s in any museum open to the public, no examples sitting on display at an air show where a curious teenager could walk up and touch the airframe. If you've seen one, it was almost certainly at a closed Army evaluation or a Sikorsky test facility in Florida. And that's a very short list of people, mostly engineers, test pilots, and a handful of Army program officers who got a demonstration flight that most of the public will never know happened. Number 2. Boeing-Sikorsky RAH-66 Comanche. The Comanche is one of the most expensive helicopters most Americans have never heard of, and that's precisely the point. Boeing and Sikorsky teamed up in the late 1980s to build a stealth reconnaissance and attack helicopter for the Army, something that could slip past enemy radar the way an F-117 does on a much smaller scale. It had internal weapons bays instead of external hardpoints, radar-absorbent composite skin covering nearly the entire fuselage, and a 5-blade main rotor engineered specifically to reduce noise signature. You were supposed to hear a Comanche a fraction as far away as a standard Apache, giving a pilot precious extra seconds before an enemy on the ground even knew it was there. The program's ambitions went far beyond stealth shaping. The Comanche was designed with an entirely new mission computer architecture, advanced sensor fusion between infrared and low-light cameras, and a data-sharing system meant to feed targeting information directly to Apache gunships and ground units in real time, features that wouldn't become standard across the military for another decade. It was, in many ways, built 10 years ahead of the technology the rest of the Army was ready to support. Only 2 prototypes ever flew, starting in 1996. The program consumed nearly $7 billion in development before the Army canceled it outright in 2004, redirecting the funds toward unmanned drones and upgrades to existing Apache and Black Hawk fleets that were considered more immediately useful in Iraq and Afghanistan. Neither prototype was ever handed to a squadron, and no production Comanche was ever built, despite the Army having once planned to order over 1,200 of them. One prototype sits today at the U.S. Army Aviation Museum at Fort Novosel in Alabama, viewable, but far from the crowds that flock to see fighter jets at major air shows. The other prototype was used for further ground testing before being retired to storage. For a helicopter that stealth technology this advanced was built into, almost no one outside the Army program itself ever watched it fly, and the entire multi-billion-dollar effort exists today mostly as a footnote in defense budget histories. Number 3. Bell X-22. Long before tiltrotor aircraft like the Osprey became household names, Bell was already testing the concept in a machine so strange it looked like something bolted together from spare parts by an engineer who'd never seen a normal aircraft. The X-22 used 4 ducted fans mounted on rotating wings. The entire duct assembly would tilt from vertical, for helicopter-style takeoff, to horizontal, for forward flight like a conventional airplane, blending the vertical lift of a helicopter with cruise speeds closer to a small transport plane. It was NASA and the Navy's joint attempt in the mid-1960s to figure out whether vertical takeoff aircraft could actually replace conventional runways for combat resupply on ships and forward bases without a landing strip. The design was strikingly advanced for its era, incorporating one of the earliest fly-by-wire control systems ever fitted to an American aircraft, allowing a computer to blend and stabilize inputs across all 4 tilting ducts simultaneously, something a human pilot alone would have struggled to manage smoothly. That fly-by-wire testing alone made the X-22 valuable to engineers well beyond its own program. Only 2 airframes were built. The first crashed on its very first hover test in 1966 due to a wiring fault in the flight control system, destroying the aircraft before it ever proved anything and nearly ending the entire concept before it started. The second X-22 flew for nearly a decade afterward, racking up over 400 test flights out of Edwards Air Force Base and NASA facilities, and its data quietly shaped tiltrotor and ducted fan research for decades. Engineers working on the V-22 Osprey program studied X-22 flight data directly when they began developing that aircraft's own tilting rotor system in the 1980s. Despite that legacy, the aircraft itself never became a production vehicle in any form and never carried a single operational mission. The surviving X-22 is preserved at the Niagara Aerospace Museum in New York, one of the only places on Earth you can actually stand next to it and see, up close, just how odd early vertical lift experimentation really looked. Number 4. Piasecki X-49 Speedhawk. The X-49 Speedhawk started life as an ordinary Sikorsky UH-60 Blackhawk before Piasecki Aircraft got its hands on it. Piasecki stripped off the standard tail rotor and replaced it with a ducted fan borrowed from their own compound helicopter research going back to the 1960s, then bolted stub wings onto the fuselage to offload lift from the main rotor at speed, reducing the drag and vibration that normally limits how fast a conventional helicopter can safely fly. The goal was simple on paper: take a helicopter the military already trusted, already flew by the thousands, and make it 50 miles per hour faster without redesigning it from scratch or asking the Army to adopt an entirely unfamiliar airframe. It worked, and it worked well. The X-49 demonstrated sustained speeds over 200 miles per hour in testing between 2007 and 2008, an enormous jump over a stock Blackhawk's typical cruise speed. Pilots who flew it noted it handled essentially like a familiar UH-60 in low-speed maneuvers, meaning the Army wouldn't have needed years of retraining to adopt it, normally one of the biggest hidden costs of introducing a new aircraft type. But it was a privately funded demonstrator competing for attention inside an Army budget already committed elsewhere to programs like the Comanche and later the Future Vertical Lift Initiative, and funding dried up before a production decision ever came. Only one X-49 was built, converted from a single existing Blackhawk airframe, and it never flew publicly again after testing concluded around 2008. It's currently in storage, not on display anywhere the public can visit, making it one of the few helicopters on this list that not only wasn't mass-produced, but effectively vanished after proving its own concept worked exactly as promised. A rare case of a program dying not from failure, but simply from bad timing. Number 5. Sikorsky CH-54 Tarhe. Nicknamed the Flying Crane, the CH-54 Tarhe looks unlike almost anything else that's flown. No enclosed cargo bay at all, just an open latticework fuselage built entirely around a hook and a winch, with the cockpit perched forward like the cab of a construction crane rather than the nose of an aircraft. Sikorsky designed it in the early 1960s purely to lift things too big or too awkward for a conventional cargo helicopter, and during Vietnam, it carried armored vehicles, downed aircraft recovered directly from the battlefield, and even prefabricated container pods called people pods that slotted onto its frame frame like a detachable cabin, capable of carrying troops or serving as a mobile field hospital. Its recovery missions became legendary among Army aviation crews. A single CH-54 could retrieve a downed helicopter worth millions of dollars from deep in hostile territory, saving equipment that would otherwise have been destroyed or left to the enemy. Some crews credited the Tarhe with recovering more aircraft value than almost any other single airframe type flown during the entire war. Roughly 105 were built between 1963 and 1972, which sounds substantial until you compare it to the thousands of Chinooks and Blackhawks produced across the same decades. The Army retired the last Tarhes from active service by the early 1990s, and today, the type survives almost entirely through a handful of civilian operators using surplus airframes for logging and heavy-lift firefighting work in remote forest terrain across the western United States. You won't see one at a major air show, and you certainly won't see one flying near a populated area. Its work happens over mountains and wildfire zones most people never travel to, and few cameras ever reach. A small number are preserved at military aviation museums, including the U.S. Army Transportation Museum in Virginia, but as a flying aircraft, the CH-54 has almost entirely disappeared from public view, quietly doing dangerous, unglamorous work far from anyone who might recognize what it once did in Vietnam. Number 6. MIL Mi-26 Halo. The Mi-26 Halo isn't rare because few people wanted it. It's rare because almost nobody outside Russia and a handful of former Soviet states could ever operate one. It remains the largest and most powerful helicopter ever put into series production, powered by two enormous turboshaft engines turning an 8-blade main rotor over 105 feet across, big enough to lift entire armored vehicles or complete building sections in a single sling load. Its maximum takeoff weight sits north of 56 tons, more than double what a Chinook can manage. The scale of the machine created its own problems. Very few countries besides Russia ever operated the Mi-26, partly because of its cost, and partly because NATO nations already had the Chinook filling a similar heavy lift role. It became famous in the West mainly through disaster response footage. Mi-26 is hauling downed helicopters out of Chechnya or lifting shielding structures during the Chernobyl cleanup, tasks few other aircraft on Earth could physically perform. A small number have flown for private commercial operators and firefighting contracts in Europe, but for most Americans, an actual Mi-26 in person simply isn't something you'll ever encounter outside a defense trade show or a documentary clip. Number 7. Kamov Ka-32. The Ka-32 looks fundamentally different from almost any Western helicopter because it has no tail rotor at all. Kamov built it around coaxial contra-rotating rotors stacked on top of each other, a design philosophy the Soviet Navy favored because it made the aircraft shorter and easier to operate off cramped ship decks, without a long tail boom vulnerable to waves or hangar walls. That same compactness later made it valuable for an entirely different job: precision urban firefighting, where a Ka-32 can hover directly over a burning high-rise and drop water with a level of positional stability a conventional tail rotor helicopter struggles to match in gusty city winds. Despite that usefulness, the Ka-32 remains almost invisible in North America. Cold War-era trade restrictions and later sanctions limited how many ever reached Western operators, and most of the fleet still flies in Russia, South Korea, and parts of Europe on firefighting and heavy lift contracts. A handful operate in Canada under special certification, making them one of the only places in North America where you might glimpse one at all. But for the average American aviation fan, the Ka-32 is a helicopter they've likely never seen fly, despite decades of continuous production. Number 8. Kaman K-MAX. The K-MAX looks almost comically narrow in person because Kaman designed it around a single job: lifting cargo, not carrying people. It has no real cabin to speak of, just a slim fuselage, a single pilot seat, and two intermeshing rotors that turn in opposite directions without needing a tail rotor at all, a configuration borrowed from Kaman's own helicopter designs going back to the 1940s. That intermeshing design lets nearly all the engine's power go directly into lift rather than fighting torque, making it exceptionally efficient at repetitive external load work like logging in mountainous terrain where a conventional helicopter would waste fuel just staying stable. What makes the K-MAX genuinely rare to witness is what the Marine Corps later did with it, converting examples into unmanned aircraft that flew real cargo resupply missions over Afghanistan without a pilot on board at all, one of the earliest large-scale uses of an unmanned helicopter in an active war zone. Very few were ever built compared to mainstream helicopter programs, and most that exist today work quietly for logging companies in the Pacific Northwest or under military contract, never appearing at public air shows or populated flight paths. Unless you've stood near an active logging site or a classified test range, the odds you've ever seen a K-MAX fly are genuinely low. Number 9. Boeing MH-47G Chinook. Most Americans have seen a Chinook. The twin-rotor silhouette is instantly recognizable from decades of news footage and military parades. Almost nobody has seen an MH-47G. This is the Special Operations variant, built for Night Stalker crews flying the Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and it's deliberately built to avoid exactly the kind of public visibility a standard Chinook gets. It carries extendable aerial refueling probes, allowing it to refuel mid-flight from a tanker aircraft, extending its range far beyond anything a conventional Chinook can manage, alongside terrain-following radar and defensive countermeasure systems rarely discussed publicly in any detail. These aircraft fly the missions that don't make press briefings, the ones flown at night, at low altitude, into locations that were never meant to be photographed. Fewer than 75 are believed to exist, a tiny fraction of the roughly 1,200 Chinooks Boeing has built across all variants combined. They don't appear at civilian air shows, and unlike a standard Chinook, you won't find a retired MH-47G sitting in a public museum. Its equipment and mission history are still considered too sensitive to display. For a helicopter flying actively within the US military today, it may be the single hardest one on this list for an ordinary person to ever actually witness. Number 10. Leonardo AW609. The AW609 isn't a helicopter in the strict sense at all. It's a civilian tiltrotor, the only one of its kind ever developed for commercial and private use, blending vertical takeoff with the cruise speed of a small business turboprop. Its two engines rotate at the wingtips, lifting off like a helicopter before tilting forward to fly like a fixed-wing aircraft at speeds over 300 miles per hour, nearly twice what a conventional executive helicopter can manage over the same distance. Development stretched across more than 2 decades, first under Bell and Augusta jointly, then solely under Leonardo after Bell exited the partnership in 2011, with certification delays pushing the aircraft's civilian debut years past its original target. A fatal crash during testing in 2015 added further scrutiny and delay to an already slow certification process. As of today, the AW609 still has not received full civil certification in the United States, meaning not a single customer aircraft has entered commercial service anywhere in the world. The few flying examples that exist remain company-owned test and demonstration aircraft, occasionally shown to potential buyers at private events closed to the public. It may be the rarest aircraft on this entire list for a simple reason. Technically, it isn't finished yet.